Welcome everyone to the first of our events for the Saturday of our New College Festival of Books and Belief. You're very welcome here, and I'm delighted that you've come to join us to hear our lecture this morning. Rowan Williams, Lord Williams of Oystermouth, was the 104th Archbishop of Canterbury, a position he held from 2002 until 2012. He's had a distinguished academic career, both in Oxford and Cambridge, with honorary Doctor of Divinity degrees being awarded from both universities and more than a dozen others. He's a noted poet and translator of poetry, and his most recent publication is A Century of Poetry, 100 Poems for Searching the Heart. His collected poems from 2021 is a distillation of a long career of poetic creation, as impressive as it is personal and inspiring. His intellectual and religious interests range widely, however, and we are reaping the benefits of this range and depth today. Today, Lord Williams is giving the third of 3 public lectures funded by the Templeton Religion Trust as part of a project running here at the School of Divinity. The aim of the project is to explore the relationship between sacred art and spiritual reality, with a focus on the Edinburgh Festival of the Sacred Arts. The first of our lecturers was the composer Roxana Panufnik, who considered the role of music in conveying spiritual understanding. The second was Malcolm Geit, who spoke about poetry, and recordings of both of these lectures are available on the project website, accessed through the School of Divinity website. Lord Williams today will consider the role of the visual arts, and the title of his lecture is Seeing the Light, Epiphany in Visual Art. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished speaker.
Thank you very much, Alison, and good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for being part of this event. As you will have gathered, I'm slightly going beyond my ordinary comfort zone this morning in reflecting on the visual arts, but I hope that those present who know more about it than I do will be able to cast some epiphanic light on the subject in later discussion. But I want to begin with a very obvious and often neglected question, which is simply, what do visual artists think they're doing? The default setting for many of us in thinking about this is that the ideal form of visual art is really some kind of reproduction, some kind of imitation. And yet, the mysterious fact about visual art is that people go on doing it. If your purpose is to reproduce, to copy, then in principle, there could be an ideal, an adequate copy, and you wouldn't ever need to do it again. Somebody would have, to put it in very simple terms, would have painted the definitive view of Snowdonia. And if anybody else wanted to do it, the answer would be, well, that's been done. You'll have to find another mountain. And one of the things that really intrigues me about the visual arts, especially what are usually called the representational varieties of visual art, is the way in which great artists keep coming back to a face, a setting, a scene, a theme. And as we'll see later on, that's not restricted to the visual arts, but it's very particularly obvious if you think of Monet's water lilies and his paintings of Givenchy and the haystacks, if you think of Rembrandt's self-portraits, and if you think of a couple of modern artists like Craigie Aitchison or Maggie Hambling, who again return obsessively, we might say, to the same subject matter, and very often, very literally, the same scene. Craigie Aitchison's extraordinary paintings of crucifixion scenes over the years. And one artist I'm going to mention in passing today is Celia Paul, who has, I think, produced probably between 80 and 100 paintings of her mother. So why? Because if reproduction and imitation is what matters most, something is clearly not fitting here, something else is going on. And so a first point I want to put to you is something to do with the difference or the tension between reproduction and representation. Representation is, as those of you who've ever done me the courtesy of reading things I've written on the subject will know, representation is an issue that interests me enormously. And it seems to me that representation is a very central human activity. Human beings, typically, characteristically, represent the world they're in. That is, they don't merely copy, they seek to align with, expose to, and further the agency of what is experienced. If we scroll back to the very beginnings of visual art in the human story, what we see, apparently, is an art more or less inseparable from ritual. You represent the hunt. You represent the desired, the sacred animal, partly to contain it and partly to enter into it. A very mysterious double movement, which I'll again come back to later. There's an urge, it seems, in us as conscious beings to harness and cooperate with and also immerse ourselves in energies around us that go beyond the self and the immediate human community. That's why in what we patronizingly call primitive forms of religious culture, in shamanic practice, for example, in the Arctic and subarctic regions, or indeed in Latin America, in shamanic practice, those styles of ritual and changed awareness that belong to that kind of religious practice, there is a very intentional exposure to forms of life, forms of behavior, to which the shaman opens himself or herself. Energies enter, energies often from the animal world and from the spirit world. And the shamanic dance and the shamanic dream, and often the shamanic poem as well, will reflect and embody something which is not just what's going on inside the shaman's head. The shaman, in other words, is not an Anglican parson in exotic dress. Purposeful shapes of agency are discerned in the world around, and they're believed to be translatable. Somehow those forms, rhythms, or frequency of agency can be assimilated in, reenacted in the human body. And the form that you sense in the world around, the intelligible pattern of agency or energy, is translatable not only into something going on inside my head, but something I do with my entire body. Not only something I do with my entire body, but something which my entire body can bring to being in the world. Representation, in other words, depends on a kind of implicit theory about our relation with the world as conscious beings. Our consciousness picks up what there is, seeks to harness it, seeks to control it, fails, seeks to align with it, might succeed, seeks to make something of it. In action, in speech, which is of course a physical activity, we shouldn't forget that, and in making. So, that's the very broad theoretical assumption I'm starting from. Something about the work of representing, making present under another embodiment, but with a continuity of form. That very great poet and artist, David Jones, of whom again more later, made great play in his famous essay on art and sacrament with the continuity between what had to be said about art and what theologians wanted to say about the sacrament. The sacrament is and is not the energy, the action it represents. It is, in one sense, a welcoming of that action within the human sphere. At another level, it's our absorption into an action that is beyond the human sphere. So, David Jones wants to argue there really is a spectrum, a continuum of kinds of representing activity, with sacramental activity at the most charged and complex end of that, but all kinds of representational activity going on in the background of all kinds of routine and apparently prosaic human lives and human behaviors. Language itself represents this energy in the form of sound. Sound, of course, being, again, a bodily reality. How very bizarre that we talk about our senses, our five senses, and most of the time behave and speak as if only two of them were really physical. That's for another day. But very often, a visual representation is seen as a kind of paradigm of this strange process. Because, quite obviously, the seduction of regarding a visual representation as a successful copy is a very strong temptation, and one that artists struggle with, and, if they're any good, conquer. Back to what I said right at the start, good artists go on representing. They don't say, I have now caught that perception, and can leave it. Now, of course, relatedness, recognizable relatedness to what is visibly there around us, isn't in itself something that a philosophical or theological aesthetic should turn away from. And in classical aesthetic theory, in ancient and late antique Greek thought, for example, it's very clear that capturing what was sometimes called the enargia, the inner force and structure of what was there, was part of what a good work of art actually sought for. And it's from the classical world that we have those little anecdotes about painters who could paint grapes so realistic that birds would go and peck at the walls. But there's a good deal more going on in the classical and post-classical world than that. That adequacy to what's there is not the only principle that comes into play. Because what you seek to do in representing is, of course, to select, to highlight, to cast light upon those aspects of your phenomenal world that will give you the most powerful and durable clue as to what's really going on in what you're seeing. You select as you see. And a Monet or a Rembrandt, going over and over and over the same scenes and the same faces, will be consistently, continuously looking for different perspectives, selecting different patterns, so as to bring out significance. All representation, you could say, though not necessarily abstract, is a process of abstraction. All art is a seeing and also a deliberate not seeing of certain things, in order to bring out what is significant and communicative, what expresses the living form of what you encounter. In order to do that, you have to stop looking at some bits of what's in front of you, and to watch how an artist returns to and reworks the same theme over and over again is to see how, in a succession of activities, the artist decides to ignore different aspects of what's there. What they're not seeing or not representing, not reproducing, is as significant as what's actually there. All art is abstract, in the sense of being abstractive. It abstracts from the unmanageable fullness of the impressions that are flooding in, so as to draw out form. The most extreme example of this in the literature that I've come across is a comment and discussion of the great Sri Lankan philosopher Ananda Coomaraswamy many decades ago, when he reproduces in one of his essays on aesthetics a picture by a Western missionary of, I think it's a Maori chieftain from New Zealand. And according to the story, the Maori chieftain was shown this picture of himself and found it completely unrecognizable. When asked, so, what do you look like in your own imagination? The Maori chieftain sketched the pattern of his tattoos. That was what he looked like. That was what mattered. And so his effective portrait would be the pattern of the tattoos. And all the completely irrelevant material about the length of his nose or the size of his earlobes was neither here nor there from his point of view. That was what you had to ignore. Whereas a Western, probably missionary especially, would no doubt think that the tattoos were what needed to be ignored or sketched in vaguely. So, art organizes a limited range of data according to what is believed, in this particular encounter anyway, to carry most effectively the active form. And that, I suppose, is why my title includes that idea of light, bringing to light, casting light upon. We illuminate, we highlight different elements that we regard as significant. We say the real picture is the tattoo. Or we say the real picture is the size of the earlobe. But we're making quite interesting and quite weighty choices when we work in that way. And that's also why I say that when we think about so-called representational and so-called abstract art, we are once again dealing with a spectrum, not a simple binary. Because the abstract artist is saying, what is really significant, load-bearing, meaning-bearing in our environment is a set of relations of planes and solids, or relations of gradations of pigment. A really great abstract artist, a Mondrian, a Malevich, and Kandinsky. These are people who are interested in what they regard as fundamental relations of mass, volume, and line in the world. They're doing the tattoo thing, if you like. They're saying what matters in our environment is these underlying formal structures and relations. So it's perhaps worth bearing in mind that, as I say, we're not dealing with a simple standoff there. So, stepping back from this a little bit, let's go back to the point that this is something human beings seem to do, and they seem to have been doing it for quite a long time, if cave art is anything to go by. And those traditions of cave art can be mapped and traced very effectively in some relatively modern examples as well. Some of you may just have come across the work of David Lewis Williams on the art and the mythology of the so-called Bushmen tribes of southern Africa. And Lewis Williams gives a very sophisticated account of the structure, the patterning, the drama, the narrative underlying a lot of even 19th century paintings from the Khoi and San peoples of southern Africa. He also has some extremely comical pages on what some of the first discoverers of these paintings thought they were of. Nobody seems to have considered actually asking the people who painted them, because, you don't do that. So, what are we assuming about human beings in all of this? I want to suggest that there are two dimensions of anthropology, a doctrine of the human, that are being proposed or presupposed in thinking of representational art in this way. And the first is that our perception of ourselves as human is, it seems, from the very roots of consciousness, a perception that we need to become attuned, or perhaps reattuned, to an environment from which our consciousness has in some way distanced us. Consciousness makes us, of course, by definition, aware of subject and object. And that awareness of subject and object can lead us into all the strange mythologies that Western humanity in particular has been prey to in the last few hundred years, which is the idea that out there is stuff, and in here there is something interesting. And for stuff to become interesting, I have to think about it. What if our relation with the world around is not quite like that? What if our representation is the constantly unfinished business of trying to not exactly overcome, but negotiate the distance between consciousness and the world? Is that what we're assuming about human beings, that they are always on the road back to, or forward to, a form of relation with the material world they're part of, which is not simply that of subject over against passive object? And that's why I've emphasized so much the element in artistic activity of aligning with or attuning to a sort of agency, a sort of energy that has structure and direction. We're looking for a participation in the physical environment, which is not just the instinctive reaction of the non-conscious organism, but an agenda of restoration, reconciliation. If you want to be very epigrammatic about it, you could say that art is part of how we make our peace with our world. And that's a very strange thing to say when you think of some kinds of art. Is Goya, for example, in some of his nightmare pictures, making peace with the world? Actually, he may well be. And I'll have a word to say in a moment about the sense in which I think that might be true. So that's one aspect of humanity we seem to be working with. We are the sorts of beings who need to negotiate the relationship between our consciousness and our world in a way that overcomes crude models of power and control, crude models of active self and passive stuff. We are committed to a process in which, yes, that world becomes part of us and we become part of it. Again, like the shaman I referred to, we enter into something that enters into us in this action. But something follows from this. And so the second aspect of our thinking about our humanity is art has a lot to do with the inescapable time-taking of human awareness, human consciousness. We are temporal beings. We take time. We grow into our seeing. Epiphany, to pick up the word I used in my title, epiphany turns out not to be a matter of once-for-all illumination, but a matter of acquiring habits of seeing differently. And habits are exercised in time. They are learned, they are matured, they are extended, they are refined. They work temporarily. So, yet again, think of the artist revisiting the same scene, the same face. Acquiring a habit of seeing, taking time with what presents itself, and not imagining that perception is, as you might say, a lightning raid on the world, which runs back with something tied up and packaged that can be stored in the consciousness for future use. It's something which continues to expand, to be probed, and to probe in turn. Any representation displays in some way, as I've said earlier, what it misses, what it's not engaging with, and so displays what it requires. Any serious work of art, in effect, says to the artist, and perhaps to other artists, there's more to be done. I can recall many years ago a conversation with a very forceful and rather idiosyncratic Canadian sculptor, Rowan who described to me his own Damascus Road moment as an artist when he realized that he had to be an artist. He said he'd gone to an exhibition of Rodin's work when he was 17. And he said, when I'd finished going around the exhibition, I thought, there's something missing from this exhibition, and it's my work. It's a very dramatic way of expressing what I think many artists do actually feel, not in an egotistical or superior way. But here is something that requires another perspective, another act of seeing, more time to be taken. What Rowan was saying, I think, was that he had an intuition of where Rodin was pushing, what Rodin was focusing on and what he was not focusing on, and suddenly that came together for him as a possibility that he might be able to realize. The jury is out, of course, on whether he did or didn't. But it's such a telling way of putting it, and I've never forgotten it as an account of how the artistic vocation might work. I mentioned earlier the work of Celia Paul, and some of you, I hope, have seen her extraordinary autobiography a few years ago, Self-Portrait. Perhaps rather fewer of you will have seen this book, Letters to Gwen John, recently published. Gwen John, arguably the greatest female artist and one of the greatest artists, full stop, in Britain in the last couple of centuries. Gwen John has always been, for Celia Paul, a very particular kind of lodestar and point of reference. And here is a series of reflections on Gwen John's paintings and imagined correspondence with Gwen John, letters to Gwen John, picking up aspects of Gwen John's life and her own writing and reflection on art. But I mention it because there is a phrase that Gwen John uses in a notebook, which seems, again, to have something very fundamental to say about this. She's writing in 1927, "Sometimes my work tires me. It isn't often a pleasure. It has always been tiring and difficult. I do it as I do my housework because it has to be done and it has the same degree of importance. The only difference is that painting is more tiring." and also sometimes gives me little surprises. At around the same time she's writing in her notebook, art has to be made. It's no good waiting for it to emerge gradually from within oneself. And from a letter, again in the same period, my art was not born. It didn't come out of a mould. Art has to be made. And it seems to me that's a phrase which captures this sense of continuous, perhaps cumulative, engagement. When something has been said, done, expressed, created, stepping back and noticing what you have had to ignore in order to do that. And then either for you or for somebody else, saying, now, let somebody else look at it another way and start all over again. So, thus far I've made some suggestions about what's going on in the act of representing. I've noted that there seems to be something rather basic, rather primordial about this urge to represent, and that its roots are in ritual, the ritual by which you enter into what is around you and it enters into you, how significant patterns of form, agency, energy are absorbed and kindled into another kind of life in another kind of medium. And I've suggested two aspects of what human nature might be that seem to be presupposed by this activity. Our perception of the need to be in some way reconciled with what is there, our sense that we are always in our thinking and our making, taking time more and more. So, to shift briefly to a more nakedly theological register, you can, I think, see where some of this might be a reflection that opens itself out onto theology. Does art have something to do with atonement? Or to put it the other way around, does atonement have something to do with art? If our sense is of ourselves as a consciousness which always risks alienation from what's around it just by the fact of being a consciousness, is it at all possible for peace to be made again with that of which we are conscious? And art is not simply, as I've said, the humanizing of the world, not simply this sovereign gaze directed from in here to out there. We haven't got an adequate form of words for this. It's the making cosmic, the making worldly of the human, recognizing that it is characteristically human to be informed, to be shaped by what we encounter. And the artist, perhaps most obviously the visual artist, is poised on that intriguing and elusive point of balance between receiving and responding, between being informed and creating or drawing out form. That's what is human. And if it is human to be informed in that way, well, that is a perspective that often seems to be overlooked in more individualist societies and even more individualistic aesthetics. I would want to raise the question of whether it's actually possible to have an individualist aesthetics at all, but that again is matter for another day. And to make that point is perhaps to bring us back to that spectrum which David Jones in Art and Sacrament seeks to draw out, the overlap between art and sacramental practice as a two-way transformation. The world becomes different, but so do I. the artist receiving and processing, negotiating the impression, becomes the effect of that perception in action, becomes what is seen, at the same time as what is seen becomes what the artist does and makes. Just as in the Eucharistic language of the Church, what's going on is both an eating and a being eaten, an absorbing and a being absorbed in what is there. And I wonder, this is perhaps pushing it uncomfortably far, whether this helps us at all with thinking afresh about the divine image. There's a fair amount of literature about how human creativity is in some way a reflection of the divine image in us. God makes something out of nothing or order out of chaos, and we typically make order out of chaos as human beings. That doesn't necessarily seem to be a prevailing feature of our world at the moment, never mind our United Kingdom politics at the moment, but you get the general theoretical point. But what if actually the divine image is something a little bit more than that? Not just creativity in general, but a creativity which is the freedom to reconcile, the freedom to bring and hold together. What if it's the freedom to weave together our sensibility and our environment over time, so that the image of God in us is an image, and I'm talking here, of course, within the Judeo-Christian framework, an image of that narrative of a God who is constantly reweaving, reconstituting, reshaping a reconciled relationship between humanity and its environment. The God of that narrative is a God constantly drawing humanity and the world together in the very process of drawing humanity and the world to God. The God of this narrative is a God who characteristically and repeatedly recovers apparently lost meanings and buried connections. Is that the image and likeness in which humanity is made? Not the image and likeness of a God who is, in general and eternal terms, abstractly creative. Important to believe that, but I'm never quite sure how much it helps us understand human creativity. But what if we link it with the particular narrative of the kind of God believed in this tradition and move from there? The God who makes and mends. And that, of course, leads me to a final cluster of thoughts which I promised I'd return to. Some of this might suggest, in the minds or hands of some, that art always looked for, well, resolution, consolation, something of that order. If it's about reconciliation, if it's about uncovering and restoring the lost and holding things together, must art then always be, alarming word, positive? In which case, of course, a huge amount of human artistic endeavour would immediately have to fall off the radar, from Goya to King Lear and Sophocles. So that can't be right, can it? But what then might we be saying here? Again, I'm thinking of Goya as someone who famously or notoriously represents atrocity. Represents, in some of his paintings, actual atrocities, massacres and the like. Represents in his sketchbooks what may very well be imagined atrocities. This is what human beings are capable of doing to one another. Let's imagine the worst. But when Goya does this, it seems, from the way in which the work is done and the way in which he himself seems to have understood it, it's not an indulgent, you might say, pornographic creation of compromising and corrupting images. It's really saying, and this relates to a lot of discussions about the nature of tragedy in art, it's really saying something like this, that the capacity to represent what we might think is unbearable becomes itself an exercise in truthfulness and in hopefulness. The mere fact of representing what might be unbearable is a way of opening up the unbearable to kinds of force or agency other than our own. Certainly a kind of humanizing of what seems to be profoundly dehumanizing elements of our world. To express it in those terms is, of course, risky. It can give to the artist a messianic overconfidence in how much can be achieved by art. It can give to the practice of art an unhelpfully, what should I say, theologically loaded sense of what the artist's business is. It can lead to the wrong kind of blocking out and selectivity. And yet, the representing of atrocity and of suffering declares that atrocity and suffering are to be witnessed with intelligence and imagination and compassion, and therefore that raw atrocity, unmitigated, unmediated pain is not the fate of the world, not the last word or the defining word. And there is the great paradox of tragedy. By showing what is worst, you are somehow able to say the worst is not necessary. In short, that kind of representation keeps alive the possibility of discovery, the possibility of breaking open in some way the ways in which we experience and receive the world, and so the possibility of hope, and dare we say, the possibility of grace within the workings of the world. That very strange kind of epiphany, which is not the overwhelming inbreaking of right answers and eternal truths, but the sense that the ordinary has in its depths recreative energy beyond our imagining. One of Gwen John's teachers, her drawing tutor, Henry Tonks, who was extremely hostile to the post-impressionists, I'm sorry to say, wrote, "Why I hate post-impressionism or any form of subjectivity is because they, its followers, do not see that it is only possible to explain the spirit by the things of the world. So that the painting of an old Mackintosh, I don't pretend to explain how, very carefully and realistically wrought, may be much more spiritual than an abstract landscape. There is no shortcut to poetry. The representing of the ordinary, including sometimes the shocking, the difficult, the atrocious ordinary, and also the utterly mundane, can be an opening onto epiphany and onto grace. And we continue to engage in this bizarre business of representation because it seems our very human consciousness is conditioned to do just that in its awareness of its sudden, baffling, and hurtful alienation from the world in which it knows it belongs. Art attempts to realize that knowledge of belonging, whatever its strains, whatever its tensions, whatever its unfinished business. And that, I suppose, is why we go on doing it. Thank you.
Lord Williams has been gracious enough to take some time to answer questions. So if you have a question, we have a roving mic. I see a question straight away here. Organa, would you like to come here? Thank you. Oh, the question is...
Thank you, Lord Williams. And when you talk, two images start to come into my mind. So you mentioned about Rembrandt. So I'm reflected upon two paintings of Rembrandt of the Return of the Prodigal Son. It's interesting that his first one captures the dynamics of the father reaching out, receiving the son. And his last one, which is painted in his old age, captures the brokenness of the young son return to the father. But there is a sense of serenity and stillness that's conveyed through the painting, which struck me as the nature of art, somehow capturing the brokenness and the banishment, the woundedness of a life in its raw reality, but somehow reaching out for in this particular painting because of the sonships that he holds and enters into the rest and serenity of the father. And in the painting, there's the older brother, well-dressed, polished, but looking skeptical towards the embrace of the father and the scene of union. Somehow it reminds me of it when you were saying about the positivity of art and the painting of art as atonement. So I think this particular painting of Rembrandt kind of captures the dilemma of the nature of art in there. But it leads me to a question when you mentioned about Goya. It reminds me of Saturn, his painting of Saturn devouring his son. It's a really bloody kind of painting and scene. So when you talk about ritual and Eucharist, Saturn's painting is to do with some kind of cannibalism or human suffering under cannibalistic suppression. And Eucharist is also a way of eating and in a different sense. So somehow also there's another kind of dilemma between cannibalism and Eucharist. So I'm wondering what's kind of your thoughts in relation to that? Or is that something, a kind of direction that you're leading towards?
Goodness, thank you. Thank you so much. Wonderful, wonderful comments on Rembrandt and Goya. Thank you, I really valued that. So very briefly on your question on Eucharist. I guess that I'd begin by saying, what is perhaps different when we're thinking about the Eucharist from the Goya picture or something like that, is here is someone declaring, the food that I give is as much myself as my flesh. The food that I give is as much myself as my flesh is. This too is my body. And that fundamental act of bestowal and sharing the breaking of bread as a sign that what happens to the flesh is, if you like, given into the lives of others. That, I suspect, is what makes it more than just the cannibal feast that the ancient Romans suspected was going on in early Christian circles. And that's why I say there is this curious duality in the Eucharist. We eat and we are eaten. We eat the life given, but that life is, of course, going to surround us and absorb us as well. And I can imagine some people living in cannibal cultures who would say, well, we believe something like that as well. But what's lacking in that is perhaps that basic, that initiating moment of offering. This which I give is as much me as this flesh and blood. But no, lots more could be said there. I'm thinking out loud here. Thank you.
There's a questioner here.
Thank you. You completely drew me in your lecture. You said about the young Sri Lankan and with Rowan, my work is missing. I was in the Rowan Museum in Paris, I think it was 60 years ago. I was there on my own, and I was just completely taken in. And it said, do not touch, of course. I found the hand going out to touch. Now, it's interesting because the man Jesus represented God on earth 2,000 years ago. And he said, I am the light of the world. He said, ye that have ears to hear and eyes to see. I recognise 60 years kind of more contemplative approach to what I see, whether it be in art or in anything. My work is learning to see. And there's something about when all the senses, when all the senses are in place, we actually feel without physically touching. And there's something about this, that the more contemplative approach to life generally. So when we're out, we do a lot of mountain climbing, being the elements, the same elements through this being as everywhere. So again, Christ saying, I'll send you another comforter, we're with you forever. I think in our religion often, we're missing this spirit of truth that's available when we get all the senses are open, but yet then beyond the physical senses. So I just want to say more about this more contemplative approach generally to art and life.
Wonderful, thank you. Yes, indeed, I agree very strongly with that. That reading, that what we're looking towards is a contemplative approach of another kind, because contemplation is quintessentially something that has to take time, that can't be rushed. If you begin a session of meditation thinking, I've got to get through this quickly, then actually, quite literally, nothing is going to happen. The time is there, and you have to respect the simple passage of time. But as I think you're hinting, that goes together with an awareness of all our senses needing to be, if you like, re-educated or reopened to a non-grasping response to what's there. When Jesus says to Mary Magdalene, don't cling to me, that's not, of course, in contradiction to his invitation to Thomas to feel the wounds, or indeed what's said at the beginning of the first letter of John, what we have seen with our eyes, heard with our ears, what our hands have handled, the word of life. Now, our hands handling, I always think of that as the sort of slow exploration, the palpating, as if our eyes were closed and we were feeling our way around a surface. And that too is part of the contemplative spirit. And I think very often with really good sculpture, above all, that's where Rowan, of course, comes to mind, but so does Barbara Hepworth. It's a way of literally feeling, touching what's possible, and allowing the time of your touching to draw out form in that. So I think it does all hang together in that contemplative spirit.
I think we have time for perhaps one more question here. Harriet? Oh, okay, no, well, let's take the gentleman with the microphone. We may still have time for yours, Harriet.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for these expanded reflections on representation. My question is about the hopeful character of tragic representation, and the fact that, at least on one viewing, that hopeful character could be consistent with the finality of death. So, if we represent atrocity, there is a hopefulness to that representation in the sense that it's brought into speech and into visual art. But from a theological point of view, we might also want to hold out the hope for a post-mortem continuity of form. And I wonder, do you see any tension between the kind of, at least from a theological point of view, maybe meager hope of drawing into speech and visual art death, and drawing into life from death through grace?
Thank you. That's a fascinating question, and my short answer, I think, is yes. I would want to connect the whole meaning-making exercise of art with a hope that is, in some sense, post-mortem. Simply because art, like other human activities, but in a very special way, art shows us to ourselves as not a little lump of mental stuff or spiritual stuff in midair, but as always interwoven with other kinds of, again, formal energy around. We're never just left to ourselves. And if you'd say, as I would say, from a Christian theological point of view, the comprehensive, fundamental form of agency on which all the universe depends is God, then that agency never leaves us alone. So that if I wanted to talk about the hope for eternal life, that's where I'd want to focus. There is an agency sustaining all things which does not leave us alone. Cannot, you might almost say, leave us alone. And so, last words are very hard to come by because of that. And actually art, people do talk about art conveying a sense of eternity or transcendence, and maybe that's where the Venn diagram overlaps. Thank you, very helpful.
Harriet, I promise you the chance for a quick question.
Thanks very much, that's kind. I'll keep it to just really briefly. What you were saying has made me think about each of our lives and how we represent ourselves. So we each take in, or we each notice just a fraction of all the information that's available to us. And that forms the meanings that we make of things. And then our bodies are very much shaped by the experiences that have happened to us and where we then go for nurture and care and safety. And so I found it so helpful what you said, because it really hits home the need to kind of know thyself, doesn't it? So that we're conscious, we can become more conscious of what we have selected and what has shaped us, and then we can make choices about it.
Absolutely right, yes. And since, as you know, I never like to end a lecture without quoting St. Augustine at some point. I think that's part of what's going on in Augustine's Confessions, isn't it? He's saying, well, I could tell the story of my life in a number of ways, but what if I told it as if trying to shine the light on the moments where the otherwise invisible continuities of God's hand on the tiller came through? What if that moment were not just random, but really significant? What about that bit of teenage vandalism? That tells me something really significant. What about that experience of intense and obsessive friendship, which I couldn't let go of? What about that experience? And so on. And yes, we retell our own stories in that way. And the important thing, I suppose, is that we do so in a context that says it's necessary to tell those stories. It's right also to keep open the possibility of telling them otherwise. And that means listening as well.
Well, our time has come to an end, and I would like to take this opportunity to let you know what else is coming up today in part of our book festival. Our next event will be a conversation between Harriet Harris and the novelists Leila Abu Leila and S.J. Paris. Two modern novelists, one who will be reflecting on Islamic spirituality in her work, the other on the role of humanism. After that, we'll see Emma Wildwoods in conversation with local authors Cameron Wiley and Jean Findlay. Cameron Wiley talks about his lifetime in education, and Jean Findlay discusses her new novel, which is about the Queen's lender, the person who funded George Watson's school. And Professor Mitchell, would you like to stand up? Has 12 free tickets for this event. If the first people to get to Professor Mitchell will get a free ticket to the event with Cameron Wiley and Jean Findlay. There are their novels there. Then we have Joshua Ralston in conversation with Disha Filio. Disha will be on screen from America. She'll be talking about her award-winning short story collection, The Secret Lives of Church Ladies. We then have a panel on contemporary playwriting and religion. Michael O'Neill will speak with Joe Clifford, David Gregg and Jamini Jethwa about their work and the role of religion in modern Scottish playwriting. And then we'll close our festival in late afternoon with James Robertson, a foremost writer in Scotland today, talking with Flora Johnston, who is a novelist who has just published her first book, What You Call Free. James will be talking about News of the Dead. So I hope you can stay on and enjoy some of our events as they take place over the rest of the day. Rowan has kindly agreed to sign books in the Rainy Hall, and so we'll leave this way, and that will take you into the Rainy Hall, where we also have the Cornerstone Bookshop and the cafe, and you'll have a chance there for Rowan to sign any books you've bought or any books you've brought with you. So now it's my happy task to ask you to thank Lord Williams again for his fascinating talk. Thank you so much.